Thanks so much, Susan. It's really great to be here. Hopefully my audio is good and everything's ready to go.
Sounds good, looks good.
Great. Well, it's great to be here. Hi, everybody. Um, I've been trying to think of how I want to kind of lead into this. There's so much that comes to my mind. Uh, I started working on international drug policy back in the 90s, in the early to mid 90s, 1990s, with the hope that someday we'd get to the point with our drug policy reform efforts in the United States that it actually would link up. I honestly thought this would happen after I was gone, like my children or my grandchildren. That's how far we've come since the 1990s. But I know a lot of folks on the call know that. That's for sure, preaching to the choir. So I am Michael Krawitz. I'm the Executive Director of Veterans for Medical Cannabis Access. And I've been working on a small sub-project since, like I say, the mid-1990s, sort of have a mandate within the drug policy reform movement. I met up with Jack Herer, Chris Conrad, and Dennis Perrone back in the mid-90s, and we talked about international drug policy. And I thought that they were going to say, oh, this person or that person is doing all this stuff, but no. They said, that sounds like a great idea, Mike, go for it. So that's what I've been doing. I've been working on international drug policy for the last however many years, and presented inside the World Drug Summit in 1998, was present in the UNGAS, United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs in 2016, helped reseat the New York NGO Committee, was very active and very a big part in the kind of reshaping of the Vienna NGO Committee. The NGO committees on drugs, by the way, are a way for you, and by the way, an NGO is a non-governmental organization. So Marijuana Policy Project, Americans for Safe Access, Susan Soares, and oh my God, I forget the name of your company here, but Susan Soares Enterprise here, all NGOs. So the international drug control treaties, I want to start out by just kind of giving a who, what, where, and why this is important sort of intro. And the easiest way that I can think of to do that is sort of ground myself in US history. So going back, and short history lesson, real short, but going back to all the way back to 1938, we have Harry Anslinger as the head of our Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the United States, championed a tax act based on the machine gun tax. First time it was used for drugs, for the Marijuana Tax Act. It is widely understood and thought that Harry Anslinger, then Ambassador Anslinger, went to the United Nations in the early 1960s and late 1950s to work on this omnibus treaty that I'll talk about in a minute. It's widely thought that he did that so that he could shore up the constitutional authority of that Marijuana Tax Act. And of course, that didn't work. In 1969, Timothy Leary won his case in the United States Supreme Court, the first of 3 times that our marijuana issue would come up in modern history in the United States Supreme Court. And Harry and the code went down. It was unconstitutional. Timothy Leary's case was that it was double jeopardy. Not double jeopardy, excuse me, it was self-incrimination. He had to incriminate himself to fill out the forms to comply with the Marijuana Tax Act. And therefore, he was incriminating himself, and that's how the Supreme Court ruled against the law. So in 1961, that's when the international treaty was passed, as I said, that Harry Anslinger was so involved in. 1969, the law goes down. 1971, new law comes up. Middle of the Nixon administration, despite the Congress being told that they would change the placement of marijuana and make it appropriate based on the findings of this big commission that President Nixon had put forth, they didn't. And the marijuana stayed in sort of a legacy placing that it was put in as a result of its placement in the defunct unconstitutional Marijuana Tax Act, so-called Schedule 1 in the United States Controlled Substances Act federal law. And that's where it stands till today. It stands. And I think it's interesting. I thought I would mention this, but that's only 1938 to 1969. It's like 30 years. We've already gone way past that, and still chugging. And the Controlled Substances Act is standing strong. So this is definitely a different iteration and a harder nut to crack. So back to the treaty. Harry Anslinger got us involved in a treaty system that was already well old. You know, it was well oiled and well old. It started in the 1890s with, if you want to do some historical searching and look around, look for the Opium Wars and the Shanghai Convention. And from that, you have a whole bunch of different agreements that range through from 1899 to 1961. Some of the testimony, especially around the 1920s and 30s, Kenzie might talk about it, I don't know, it was just fascinating how they argued over cannabis, how India made a stand against total outlaw of cannabis and sort of had to negotiate surrender there. It's just fascinating stuff. So marijuana was put into this drug control treaty in 1961. The 1961 convention, or the single convention on narcotic drugs, was basically set up around just 3 drugs: the marijuana or cannabis, as it's written in the treaty, and the marijuana written into US law. It's interesting. And the coca plant and the poppy plant. Those 3 plants, the drugs from those 3 plants were basically the cornerstones of what the international treaty was based on. The international treaty calls for the non-medical and non-scientific use of drugs to be wiped out. It comes from the position that the non-medical use and the non-scientific use can be eliminated, and that it should be eliminated. I think those are both false pretenses. But it's very important that the international drug control treaties do very strongly support the use of medicine. The way you'll hear later, you know, talking about this, how the DEA has sort of twisted this, and the Department of Justice has twisted this treaty to say things that it doesn't say. It very much supports medical access, and it is, to this day, and will continue to be, the way that civilized nations handle drugs in an orderly way. The way that you get prescription medications and all the drugs that you get all come through this system. And without the drug treaty, you're basically going to throw the world into chaos. And the one thing that the nations put these treaties in place for was to prevent drugs from being used as a tool of war. Again, I'll point you back to the Opium Wars, which is over 100 years ago and may seem like forever ago, but I assure you China remembers the Opium Wars. And this is very much a central thought to the treaty system. I think, you know, for this first part, I just want people to kind of have a feel for the treaty. It's just one part of a 3-part treaty system. The 1961 treaty is the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. The 1971 treaty is the Treaty on Psychotropic Substances, hallucinogenics, and so forth. And then there's the 1988 convention, which they put together to try to fight organized crime. Those 3 conventions together are the drug control program. We have entities in Vienna that run these programs day to day, and involved in the paperwork throughout the world. And just to preempt some thoughts out there, I want people to understand that the treaty system with regard to drugs is a voluntary system. And this means a lot, going in a bunch of different directions. It doesn't compel countries to write laws in one way or another. And there's no blue hat enforcement that's going to come and enforce the international policy should you break it. In fact, the United States has been the one over this course since 1961 of actually enforcing the treaty and being the boot on the back of countries that would break from any of the guidelines or the you know, the norms of the treaty system. And it's really important to understand that this treaty, it's something that is you know, not, I just want you to understand that it's not like what most people have in their mind about treaties. You know, the president and the United States, we dismiss treaties. We've have such a horrible record over 100 years of dismissing the Native Americans and others with treaty obligations. So I know, I've been out there speaking to thousands of people on the street and info tables around the country, and I know that people don't think anything of the treaties, don't wonder why we would even talk about the treaties because of the United States stand. But this is the thing. This is not an enforcement mechanism of some agreement that then tells us what to do. We tell it what to do. Believe me, when we're over there in Vienna and the United Nations, every employee of the United Nations is on their toes to try to do whatever the nations tell them to do. The countries run this thing completely. there's a delegation of authority. There's 186 countries that have signed the treaty. We're one, of course, the United States, and that authority is delegated to 53 countries that actually run the day-to-day operation of the treaty system, and that's called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And within that commission, there's a consensus process of changing policy from year to year, and it slowly basically grows and slowly understands. It's understood harm reduction in the time that I've been there. It's understood demand reduction. It started out at supply reduction. That's where the 1988 convention was. And now I think it's starting to come to grips with demand, with the next step, which is regulation, regulated markets and the need for reform. And the drug control treaty will need to be rewritten. It will need to be amended to allow for regulated adult sales of marijuana, because that's non-medical and it's non-scientific. That's an absolute wall that we're going to have to deal with at the international level to really get this all going. So I want to set that tone. I want to set that motion, that idea that this is something that the member states drive. It's not some UN thing applied on countries. It's quite the opposite. It's countries agreeing with each other and coming to an agreement throughout the world on how to handle drugs. I talked for a little bit more than I intended, but I wanted to cover a little bit into Kenzie's time. We agreed on that before, but I'm gonna hand it over to Kenzie now. I wanted, Kenzie, if you could, give us a little bit of the treaty from your perspective. Now, Kenzie Rivulé Zamuli is my buddy. He's been working side by side with me, part of the pro-cannabis team inside the United Nations, which draws on all the resources of the cannabis movement worldwide to do the job that we do. And without Kenzie, I absolutely couldn't do the job that I do. So I much love, I'm bringing on Kenzie Rivulé. If you could, whatever you want to say about the treaty, man, you're the guy. This is the person that knows more about the day-to-day operations of the resolutions and the treaty notes, I think, than anyone else I've met on the planet.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I don't know that much about the day-to-day operation of the treaty, because they do a lot of stuff on other drugs and other issues that I don't really follow. But on cannabis, I do follow quite closely. And I just wanted to maybe balance what you said. You say we have this wall, the treaty represents this wall that we need to change it, modify it, amend it to be able to regulate cannabis or legalize basically adult use. That's not really so evident. As you were saying before, the treaty is a result of, really long negotiation, 13 years of negotiations between countries, in which the USA defended complete prohibition of cannabis, including for medical and scientific purposes, total prohibition. And other countries defended the opposite. And in the end, the resulting treaty is a balanced convention which allows countries to adapt more or less as they want. But on adult use, on recreational use, there is no mention, there is nowhere written that countries should prohibit adult use or recreational use. And it's more, it says about non-medical uses that they are exempt from the treaty. And it doesn't refer to any particular specificity of what is non-medical use. It just says non-medical use is anything other than medical and scientific use. So if you really read the actual text of the convention, it's just a framework treaty for the regulation of the pharmaceutical sector of certain medicines that have some potential for dependence. It just doesn't talk about adult use whatsoever. So saying that the treaty obliges country to prohibit, it's in the end more the spirit of the promoters of the treaty, the USA, which were the one that submitted the first draft and so on and so forth, more the spirit than the actual letter of the treaty. If you read the treaty, you'll say, well, why not? It's just a treaty that wants to control certain medicine, and as you said, avoid it to be used as a weapon of influence over countries, a weapon of war in certain instances, like the opium wars. So it sort of makes sense if you really read the treaty. It's not that much of a bad treaty. It's just declaring how much, of this medicine you export to what countries, having a sort of monitoring of international trade in these medicines. there is no imposition of tariffs or things like that. It's sort of okay. So I want to say, really, let's get back to reading that treaty, really, to see if it's really a wall for us, or if it's maybe not that much of a big deal. Yeah, maybe what I wanted to say, which is maybe the reason why we're speaking about the treaties, the convention today, is this report of the WHO, um, which recommends changing the scheduling of cannabis in the conventions. So this raises a lot of attention in the USA, because you have also big issues with the scheduling in the USA. But I have to point out that it's really different in the convention. The scheduling is really, it's hard to compare. Honestly, there are some schedule in the convention, for instance, Schedule 4, which is the highest schedule, which is sort of the equivalent of maybe Schedule 1 in the USA, although not really, because it's symbolical. Schedule 4 doesn't impose prohibition, it doesn't impose any specific measure of control, it's just some sort of label that say this is evil drug. Basically, that's what it says. So you don't have that in US law. The Schedule 1 goes with specific restriction, which is not the case in the treaty. So um, I'm not sure, maybe later on we will go into the recommendation if we need to, the detail, but basically I think that the thing to understand the recommendation, it's more a sort of, I really see it, and I think, Michael, you agree with me, it's a sort of historical correction. Um, Cannabis was placed in this Schedule 4, which is the symbolical evil drug schedule, because of the pressure of the USA, but also because of WHO, which at that time was composed of Europeans and North Americans, and based its recommendation to place cannabis in that schedule on a couple of cherry-picked reports from really strange sources, like the police of apartheid South Africa and this kind of sources. So a lot of racist sources and this kind of stuff. Um, they made a really bad assessment of, they made basically no scientific assessment of cannabis. They just recommended to put it in that schedule on the grounds of heavy moral, stereotypes, and that stays like that until now. And obviously, and with the pressure of the USA and some other influent countries, the UK, France, and as you said, India, and even Iran at that time, even some African countries protested against this sort of crazy theater going on, with the WHO recommending that this drug was one of the most dangerous, etc., etc. It was just obvious that it was not for many people at the time already. Still, WHO recommended it, it was placed, it stayed like that until now. So what WHO is doing right now is not really making a revolution, it's just correcting the record, making an actual scientific assessment of cannabis in medicine, and only in medicine, which they have been doing. They have been during 3 years collecting data from all countries, collecting data from published literature, and they came up with this assessment, which is just this correction of the record. So now we're in the process of countries, as you say, in the end, it's countries running everything. So government, countries have these recommendations in hand, and they are struggling to just accept them, swallow them, sort of. So that's where we are. There is a vote in December at the United Nations, which is supposed to be in December. We never know if it will be delayed or if something will happen because of the pandemic. But it's supposed to be in December, a decision on accepting these recommendations contained in this report. And so by doing this, sort of de facto amending the treaties, amending the schedules of the convention, even though mostly symbolically, but with obviously a huge impact in all countries of the world beyond the borders of the USA. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there for the moment.
Thanks, man. I want to make sure everybody understands that one of the main goals of this evening is to, or I guess it's this evening for everybody now, is to make sure that as we're getting ready to legalize marijuana or create adult regulated markets at the national level, the MORE Act in particular, that's been in front of Congress and is stalled now, that law, that proposed law, completely ignores the treaty. And I want a discussion in the movement, and this is really why I've pulled this all together and why I've been so adamant about doing this, is I want folks to know about the World Health Organization recommendations. We'll get into that in a second. But the secondary thing for tonight is I want to create a discussion around this legalization of the MORE Act. Do we just pass the laws we're talking about passing it, or do we put something in there about the treaty? It is, as we'll talk about later, possible and very much can be considered a responsibility of the Senate to actually give guidance in an ongoing way on treaty matters. And it's a decision movement-wide. I think we need to think about, at least, do we want to give guidance to the executive branch when we legalize marijuana, or do we not? And if we do give guidance, what do we want that guidance to look like? So that's the big question. The other question, of course, is I say, I just want folks to really understand these WHO recommendations. I'm gonna run through them really quick here. So there's 8 different recommendations. They're in a couple of sets, so I'll kind of present them as sets, but 5.1 is the best one. This is the one that Kenzie and I are really hoping will actually have an impact. It's removal of cannabis from Schedule 4. That's that symbolic placement that Kenzie was talking about. 5.2.1 and 5.2.2 add dronabinol and its isomers to the 1961 convention, and respectively delete the dronabinol and its isomers from the 1971 convention. And then the 5.3 and I'll explain that in a second. 5.3.1, 5.3.2 adds THC to the #1 schedule of 1961 and deletes THC respectively from the 1971 convention. What those 4 are essentially is some housekeeping, essentially. Because THC hadn't been discovered in 1961, it was put into this next treaty where it never really belonged. It's created paperwork problems for member states. Kenzie and I really don't see much of a problem about patient access. We talk about them more later if you want, but it's really just housekeeping of moving those substances from one treaty to another parallel. I don't really see it as an increase or a decrease in control, and it really should actually make member states' job a little bit easier. Maybe even, I would say because of that alone, help patient access. And then 5.4, delete extracts and tinctures from the 1961 convention, Schedule 1. 5.5, adds a CBD footnote. 5.6, add compound cannabis medicines that are kind of less abusable to Schedule 3 of the 1961 convention. So what this means, what this does, it's a package of recommendations that normalizes cannabis as a medicine, removes it from its placement as a research-only thing, as a drug to be scared of, placed right next to heroin. It will no longer be placed next to heroin. It'll be treated, if they accept all these recommendations, essentially like any other drug. The note, there's just a little note on CBD. Hey, we put in the 1961 convention. They really could have put something about CBD. That was discovered in the 1940s, but they didn't. They didn't talk about CBD. The World Health Organization reviewed CBD. They felt that with this scientific review, just as they reviewed all the science out there for cannabis, did a pretty good job, couple years spent doing this stuff. They felt that there was some confusion out there. CBD could be seen as an extract of marijuana if it was drawn from a marijuana plant. It could be seen as an extract of hemp, which is exempt. Hemp is exempt in the treaty. So it could be seen as an exempt product. They wanted to clarify that. So this is what they did. Essentially, if you have CBD that's by itself, has just a tiny bit of THC, less than 0.2% of THC, it will be treated as a non-drug, non-controlled. If it gets up a little bit more and it has a little bit more THC in it, it would go into Schedule 3, which would be over-the-counter. Countries could set up a whole variety of different schema, but it could be over-the-counter even without a prescription. And then with increased strength, very strong straight medications that could be more abusable in the eyes of nations and the WHO, then it would be Schedule 1, which is essentially with everything else that can be at all abused. So it would normalize cannabis as a medicine. It would make it so that it was no longer kind of a forbidden thing. And just 2 or 3 quick notes about it. One is this whole process started over 10 years ago with the resolution of Japan on cannabis seeds in 2009. they wanted to increase control in the treaty to try to include seeds, which again are considered part of hemp and exempt. And they started a process. It took like 5 years before it actually mounted to a World Health Organization review process, started in 2015. And of course, now we're in the final phases where the World Health Organization has passed on the recommendations and the United Nations is about to vote on it. Unprecedented. Since the United Nations was born, since the World Health Organization was named, there's never been a full-on evidentiary review of cannabis in a placement. The process is unprecedented. Just about everything about it is unprecedented. I wanted to hand it off to Kenzie again one more time to talk about, the kind of the misnomers out there. If you wanted to, talk about some of the misperceptions about what these don't mean.
Well, quickly, because there are other people that want to take the floor, but yeah, obviously there are some countries really opposed to the recommendations, like Russia, for instance, or Nigeria. And they've been pretending that the recommendation apply to cannabis generally, which is not the case. It just applies to medicine, to cannabis, when it's used as a medication. So they are saying, WHO is trying to establish a standard at 0.2% for CBD products, which is not the case. They are doing that for CBD medicines. So for Epidiolex, not for the CBD vape pen that is not a medicine. This is just not relevant. But still, if you read almost any article on internet talking about this recommendation, they will ignore the fact that it's really focused on medicines, and that's absolutely central and quintessential in all these issues. So there are a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions like that, which make people be sometimes a bit afraid of the impact that the recommendation would have. Some say it's the legalization of cannabis. Some say, it's increasing control over THC medicine or over CBD, which is just actually not the case. If you look again at really what is written and what it means, what is their mandate, and what they are going to change in the treaty, they just change the regime on medications, and they really make it much more simple. Cannabis was virtually scheduled in 6 different schedules in 2 different conventions. So they will put it in 2 schedules instead of 6, which is already more simple. 1 convention and 2 schedules, and they will make different steps that make the access be facilitated only for the countries that want to. So these recommendations are not forcing any country to provide access to medical cannabis, because if they were, they would not be discussed. They would have been dismissed at the first second they were published, with strong oppositors like Russia or Nigeria, as I said. So yeah, a lot of misconception for something that is really mostly symbolical, mostly a simplification, a correction of the historical error, and unfortunately it will, because as I said, the vote is in December, with the situation that is going on in the USA, and with basically 3 major players, maybe 4, at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs: the USA, Russia, China, and the European Union, which is acting together in this commission, with 12 different countries in this commission. So a strong voice of the European Union. The USA is really in the middle, balanced. So far, they have not expressed clearly their opinion. They have managed to keep all of this discussion really separated from the hysteria around Donald Trump, withdrawing from the WHO, etc. This is just not related. They just continue to have good relation with WHO in what concerns discussing this recommendation, discussing cannabis in medicine. So it's sort of good on that side, but they have not expressed any position, and they will have to take a decision in December. And I'm a bit afraid of what will be the situation in the USA in terms of potential presidential transition or not at that moment. So yeah, some questions ahead.
Thanks, Kizzy. Nick, you got your ears on there? I wanted to bring in Nick Easley from 3C
Yes, sir, I
Consulting.
do.
All right. Nick is a real go-getter. We're both U.S. Air Force military veterans and kind of taking different paths, but find ourselves really being able to talk the same language, at least I understand some of the stuff he said. So anyway, Nick, I really wanted to pass this over to you, and if you could kind of tell people why this matters inside the USA. Why is this abstract, obscure United Nations stuff with the World Health Organization? You know, we can do what the hell we want. We can legalize marijuana. We don't need to worry about the treaties. Why do we need to worry about this?
Well, it's a big deal. You know, I'm Nick Easley, Managing Director, Multiverse Capital, also CEO of 3C Consulting. And, you know, I've worked in 30 states and worked in 27 countries. There's 22 of these countries currently doing imports, IHUD licenses, Denmark, Portugal, the UK, those 3 Channel Islands, Colombia working on our Uruguay side and our Peruvian side, like South Africa. So like when I'm deploying capital, when I'm thinking about like what things are going to trigger valuations, or the gates closed, like we're about to sell water and it's about to like flow down a river, but there's a big dam in this river right now. And when it comes to the 1961, 71, 1988, like these things matter to us as like capitalists, as we're thinking, you know, and I'm a disabled veteran too. I use capitalism and like business to actually make this industry better, other than just like talking about the benefits of the plant. So my friend's cat came to join and contribute to the conversation as well at the art gallery here. So essentially, if we don't have these sorts of treaties trigger, like when I look at like Vienna, what was supposed to happen in March this year, when that vote was postponed, I literally sacked about $250 million of investment valuation for international companies, because I was like, well, if that passes through, that's step 2 of this bigger step 3 process. And since in the United States, like it's incredible what we're able to get away with here, like of making like medical type products, medical devices. And then internationally, I'm doing bulk APIs, flour, oil. I'm thinking about GACP, GMP, EU GMP, all of these import-export regulations. If I'm doing something in the US that's federally illegal, but legal in the state, I got some protections. Internationally, if I have these drug compacts, like you don't mess with the UN, like you don't mess with these pharmaceutical compacts, because if we void them, we're essentially in this unique place where us as a country, if we just legalize, like Biden just gets elected and legalizes it first day, not going to happen. Hopefully just the second part of that statement, but we're the ones who caused this. So when we're looking at like the International Narcotics Control Board, when we're looking at like the WHO's recommendations to the UN, if I don't see these things trigger and they're actually changing the dialogue, changing like the scheduling of these narcotics, even non-psychoactive narcotics, we're at this position that it really slows international expansion. If you think, you know, like of a big company, I'm sure everyone's familiar with, like Canopy Growth, like they're spending like $30-50 million on some of these acquisitions internationally. South Africa trying to do their big Spain R&D thing. They start to like have to like focus on those things are not making tons of revenue. Everyone wants to import to Germany. Everyone wants to import to these other markets. But when we don't have these compacts altered, we're doing all of this preemptive development. And I think, you know, as a farm kid, like we don't grow pineapples in warehouses in Canada. And like long-term, like where are we able to produce this at very high standards, not just like it's dank bro, but like pharmaceutical standards at the lowest prices. That's not the US. There's a reason we don't produce very much here. There'll still be US cannabis, but when it comes to this international, like bulk APIs, bulk pharmaceutical products, if we don't have these sorts of changes, it just means we're preemptively spending way too much money way too early. So as these things change, I then know like, oh, it's like if we were talking, just switch context, like about online gaming or betting or something like that, it's not legal. We can concept it, we can make a platform, we can market it, we can brand it, we can think about it. But then when it comes to actually like developing this and having revenues come in, until like that law changes and it goes through House and Senate and it's signed off and we have total regulations, online gaming revenue is not going to happen. Same thing with like the massive cannabis, either on the international medical side, like pharmaceutical side, medical side, like in the compassionate use space, or in the potentialities with adult use. None of that's going to happen internationally if we're voiding and violating all of these compacts. Like Canada's not just selling to 50 countries adult use like pre-rolled joints to be sold. So until this changes, on my standpoint, it really limits certain things with like research and development, drug discovery, the drug pathway systems for like clinical trials, because many of those countries can't do this. But when you think about the change that these are going to make, Michael, and like what that's going to allow. And then specifically the countries that are like PICS countries, PIC-S, where actually it's the same as the EU, same as the US. Those are the countries that on this hodgepodge of the map, once the international regs change and it's the right climate, they're a PICS country, they have a government that's amicable for this, that's a multi-billion-dollar unicorn win. And then that's medicine to patients who need it. That's business, like to the capital that needs to drive these. And it's the US being the big bad wolf that caused all this. We think we're fine. We got MSOs. We can raise money on the Canadian Stock Exchange. Totally fine. But if this doesn't change, it's going to slow down and keep the international medical market very, very small, because a lot of those small podunk countries, no offense to the 24 that, the 23 that actually oversee that, they're not going to do what Uruguay did and just legalize medical, legalize rec and go for it. Like they have a lot on the line that they could lose, not just cannabis wise, but when it comes to actually like their pharmaceutical businesses, their testing companies, regulations, like the compacts, this isn't just cannabis we're talking, people. That's the thing I've realized when we were over in Vienna last year. People think it's just, we're talking about cannabis at these convention, like these treaties, it's all psychotropic substances or like psychotic substances. So if we don't get that right, a country could lose their ability to import export, could tank multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies. So for us, this is like the red flag that you wave before the bull. Like we get it. As soon as that bull changes and they charge at this, like these treaties start to get changed and amended, our buy-in and acceptance, it bona fides us, and it's going to legitimize us in the industry and this plant as a truly psychotropic medicinal substance that like the people need.
Great, man. I really appreciate that. I want to mention before we go on much further, and I forget about it, from the perspective at the United Nations, Canada and Uruguay, the actions that they've taken don't look the same as they do to our cannabis movement. Our cannabis movement sees them as bold steps, really leading, raising the flag of legalization and running with it. Not so much. Inside the UN, they're making very carefully couched arguments about human rights and about effective drug control, and they're both claiming to be adhering to the treaties. So we really haven't, that hasn't really triggered this conversation at the treaty level. So next, I wanted to bring in Matt Zorn. I think we're really, really lucky to have him. He's from the law firm of Yetter and Coleman. I think just about everybody on the call knows Dr. Sue Sisley. I probably met her personally. Dr. Suzanne Sisley, pioneer and really the driving force in the cannabis movement, knocking down the barriers to actually do research. And in fact, I don't think there really was much general understanding that there were barriers to doing research at the federal level until she really did her work. They already succeeded in a brief that Matt and their firm helped put in, yielded this great result of pulling out this secret 2008 DOJ memo that for the first time really gave a peek into the twisted kind of DOJ perspective of the way that they were interpreting these treaty obligations. So I've asked Matt to come in. I give him kind of two questions. I've asked him to kind of talk about this new petition that they just put in not that long ago with Dr. Sue to basically remove cannabis from its prison of Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. And I wanted to ask him, there's two parts. It's a long petition, but if you look at it, to me anyway, it looks like it's basically in two parts. One talks about kind of the structural stuff that's been stopping us with rescheduling inside the United States. And then the other part talks about something nobody's really talked about that I know of at all in the movement, and that is the treaty kind of clause in the Controlled Substances Act. So I asked him to talk about what's different from this effort, from previous efforts, and then to explain this delegation of authority argument, the second piece, and what piece of the Controlled Substances Act code related to the treaty is that all about, and why do we need to overturn it? So Matt?
Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and the focus on the treaty is something that I think Michael is correct about, and it's something people should really focus on, because it's something I think that gets left behind when we're talking about legalization, whether medicinal or recreational, that actually these treaty obligations are codified into US law. And I'll get quickly but to the point, but that is part of the difficulties in my representation of Dr. Sisley that we've run into. In fact, it is the main barrier we've run into are the treaty obligations. We filed, this is our third lawsuit on behalf of Dr. Sisley. We're representing her in the Ninth Circuit, and we are asking the court to take action, just to boil it down. We're not asking the court to reschedule it, but we're asking the court to have DEA sort of take these rescheduling petitions seriously and apply the law the way it's written in the schedules. And if they do that, then they would have to remove it from Schedule 1. Where it goes from there is a question that you would have to take evidence on and have a hearing. And but the long story is, yes, we're asking for rescheduling, but we're asking for it in a different way than people have asked for it before, which is through the administrative process and really kind of carrying out the promise that the Controlled Substances Act was supposed to carry out in 1970. We filed our brief earlier this week, so it was filed on Tuesday, and I think it's around the internet now. It's really long. It's over 100 pages, but it's really only 60 pages of text. But if you ever want to know kind of how we got here from 1970 all the way to the present, why marijuana is still a Schedule I drug, that brief will tell you. And it will tell you in detail that I don't think other filings have to date. So to answer the first question, what's different about our petition? We make different legal arguments regarding marijuana Schedule I status. There have been newer cases which have sort of shed some light as to what the appropriate legal standards are here. But also we really kind of go through the Controlled Substances Act from like a historical perspective. I did history. I was a history undergrad. I also did applied math. And really there's a historical exercise that we're doing, which is starting in 1970, we pull out source material by the people who actually wrote the act and like what they were talking about. And the guy who wrote the act, or who drafted the schedule, his name is Michael Sonnenreich, actually based the schedules off of the international system, which had already been in place in 1961. So the international treaty component was actually a really big part of drafting the domestic law that ultimately became the Controlled Substances Act. And that'll take me to the second point, which is, okay, so what do the treaties have to do with sort of my client and the advocacy? Well, turns out in the Controlled Substances Act, there are two provisions in particular, and both of them are squarely within what my client who's trying to research marijuana is trying to do. The first is to manufacture a Schedule I or Schedule II substance in the United States. Baked into the statute is this requirement that it has to conform with treaty obligations. Now, we heard earlier, and this is entirely correct, there's nothing that requires the United States to abide by these treaty obligations sort of as a matter of organic, like constitutional law, or just like, just as a general background. But there's a statute that requires us to comply with the treaties. So that's Section 823A of the Controlled Substances Act, and that says you're going to register anyone to manufacture a Schedule I or II substance, which includes marijuana. You have to comply with treaty obligations. Really, for all practical purposes, the only thing that really applies to is marijuana. And because if you go to the single convention, or cannabis generally, there are specific provisions that apply to cannabis and opium and don't apply to anything else. And I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole, but it has to do with there has to be a single government agency that has a monopoly over the substance. So there's actually rulemaking going on right now. DEA is putting forward new rules because according to the Department of Justice, DEA hadn't been complying with the treaty for 50 years. And before they're going to register anyone to manufacture cannabis for research, we're just talking about research here, not medicinal, not even recreational, or they're going to let anyone grow cannabis to support research, they have to get their system in order where everything goes through the DEA. So the DEA is now going to be ironically, the #1 trafficker of marijuana, of cannabis as far as like research. Okay, so that's the first point. The other point is scheduling, which is there's another provision in the Controlled Substances Act. It's 811D1 that, at least my read of it is, it says if a drug is subject to the single convention, you don't have to follow the scheduling procedures. Instead, the Attorney General puts the drug or other substance in the schedule he deems to be most appropriate to comply with treaty obligations. And that's it. It doesn't say anything. So the reason this is different is domestically, the way drugs are supposed to be scheduled is there are factual findings based on abuse potential and accepted medical use, and those two things are different degrees, but based on findings, a drug is put in Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive, down to Schedule 5. But this provision says if you've got treaty obligations, throw all of that out the window and just schedule it according to the treaty obligations. Now, courts have taken this statute and have interpreted it to mean something other than what the text reads. If you want to read what it actually says, I would just, Google 21 USC 811D, and it'll tell you what it says. What courts have said is, okay, well, that creates a floor, but if the Attorney General or DEA wants to schedule sort of above what the international obligations require, they still have to go through the scheduling process or whatnot. So to get what Michael, the novel argument that we are advancing is that this isn't constitutional. And it relies on this thread of administrative law, which has gotten a significant amount of play there's a case recently that was up there. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. It's an administrative law principle, and it says that Congress can't pass the buck to someone else when it comes to making law. Or if it's going to pass the buck to an administrative agency like DEA, it has to provide them with a framework to make their decisions. And our argument is you can't pass the buck to an international organization because they're not accountable to the electorate. Elect the World Health Organization or the Committee of Narcotics over at the UN. So our argument is that this 811D thing that talks about the schedule should be stricken because it's not constitutional, because in our system, we don't elect people to give their authority to some other body to determine essentially domestic criminal law. I mean, that is what we're talking about. And the reason this is directly relevant, and this is my final point, is DEA at this point in history is pointing the finger at all of these treaty obligations as the reason it can't do anything. I'll let you be the judge of whether that's pretext or whether that's, it's not, let me put it this way. It's not meritless. I mean, the single convention says what it says. But these are strictures on the current system that nobody's really talking about, because this treaty is what prevents marijuana from being moved below Schedule 2. And Schedule 2 is not that much better than Schedule 1. If you're really versed in this Controlled Substances Act, you'll see that methamphetamine is in Schedule 2 because there are some prescription applications for it. But at Schedule 2, the DEA can put in quotas. Cocaine is Schedule 2 as well. There are some medical applications for cocaine too. So a lot of people talk about, including, I think Biden's platform up to now has been moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. That could be better, but it also could be not better at all. These international treaties are really important. They have domestic application because the statute bakes it in. And so I am just glad to be here so that we can talk about this issue, because it's something that I think people who are serious about reform need to take a look at.
Thank you so much, Matt. I want to just really say a couple of quick words about the law. You talked about 2 sections in the CSA. There's no mention of this in the MORE Act. So this is what I want everyone to do. Just think about this. What got me started on this treaty stuff long ago was I read the US Constitution, which talks about treaties once ratified being the supreme law of the land, which, as I understand it from the law books, means it's kind of considered like federal law. So it won't stop us from changing the law, but nonetheless, do we really not want to mention the treaty at all when we pass a law at the federal level? This is the thought process I want everybody to take. And I found also there was a Senate responsibility to advise and consent passing treaties, but it seems it's also an ongoing responsibility as well that the Senate has. So I don't know if you want to say a couple last words there, Matt, but before we hand it off to you, I just want everyone to know they can find a lot more information about the World Health Organization recommendations, basically everything about them and what they mean, everything, in the Crimson Digest. Just type in my name or Kenzie's name in the Crimson Digest. It'll come right up on Google, or get a hold of me. I'm really easy to reach. Also, you've got the Commission Narcotic Drugs CND monitor that Kenzie has created to help understand what's going on over there as well. So back to you, Matt.
Yeah, let me just quickly get that. So there are two different types of treaties. There's what's called a self-executing treaty, and then there's a non-self-executing treaty. And drug treaties are non-self-executing treaties. And what that means is that we can enter the treaty, but until Congress goes and makes legislation, that treaty doesn't really do much of anything. And these drug treaties, so part of what the Controlled Substances Act in 1970 was meant to do was to execute these drug treaties. The Controlled Substances Act is how the United States carries out its obligation under these treaties. Without it, there's nothing sort of domestically that's enforceable as far as these treaties are concerned. But we could be held accountable, and I don't think these treaties actually have an accountability mechanism. But in theory, the place where you get disputes aired out for treaties absent a domestic statute is at the international level. But it's true what Michael said about the Constitution, which is it has treaties in there. These treaties are supreme law of the land as far as when they're self-executing. In the case of drug treaties, they aren't, but they might as well be because of the way the Controlled Substances Act was written. It was written to execute them. So they are executed, they are binding federal law, they are the supreme law of the land because the statute says it. And so that's why this is important. And that is why the secret government memo, which is talking about like this is the law when it's all it's doing is reading the treaty. The reason it's reading the treaty is because our statute says, okay, the treaty is the law. So that is how sort of these international treaty obligations figure into our drug control. And they are right now a serious problem as far as I'm concerned, and my client is concerned. So I hope that kind of addressed the issue.
Nick, any last closing words?
Well, yeah, I think this has been super informative. Like for me to actually say I've learned a lot about international drug policy is something because it really is the first domino. It's like in all of this happening, like from the industry standpoint, and normally in a suit and not looking like a rodeo hippie in an art gallery. But when I think about what's going to change a multi-trillion dollar future industry and actually alleviate so much pain and suffering and be like the change that we need for this plant internationally, we all have our little parts to play when it comes to our businesses or our lobbying or our research, but it's whatever we can do to help galvanize the change on the international level. Our domestic people are going to help us with that, but no one's standing up here and really saying we need to change that. You'll see, just like you said, Michael, MPP, Normal, Americans for Safe Access, like doing their campaigns like for medical patients or to legalize or change state laws. But we need almost like a better industry voice and then patient voice at the international level through the US. So this has really been galvanizing and motivating me to think how we could do that here back home.
I think we might have eaten up all your time there, Susan, but do you have any questions you want to ask?
Actually, you've got a few more minutes. We're waiting for Barbara Lee. There's a vote that she may not be able to make it, so we can go up until 5:05.
Okay. What do you think, Susan? You've been kind of tracking some of this stuff as we were talking. What do you think about this whole thing of the international treaties and especially our responsibility, as a United States to fix this mess that we've made around the world?
Well, I was wondering if any of you had a call to action for the viewers. How do we learn more? What can we do?
Well, the Crimson Digest lays out the plan and basically talks about the different countries that are part of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, that UN body that makes these decisions, that'll be meeting in December, hopefully, and voting on this. There's always work to be done. There's a couple of meetings that are coming up that you might be able to attend. The 8th of this month, there's an informal meeting where we're going to have members of NGOs speak before the UN on cannabis related to this WHO process. And then on, I think it's the 18th, there's going to be another United Nations meeting where we're going to have some NGOs speaking in a panel on medical access to drugs. And then, of course, just follow along. I think the thing that you could do inside the United States is certainly, you know, kind of talk to the federal government, you know, try to get a beat on where the USA is. You know, a little bit of pressure from anyone paying attention to this process is felt if you get to the right people. It's the United States State Department. It's the International Narcotics Law Enforcement Branch, or INL, in the US State Department that really carries the ball. They also work with our Office of National Drug Control Policy, our so-called Drug Czar's office, ONDCP. But those are the folks that are actually in Vienna. You can talk to them, you can reach out to them and find them inside the US. And there are a few countries around the world. I mean, I think it was 38 that Kenzie and I counted that have history of traditional use of cannabis as a medicine in their country, never talk about it at the UN. So taking that history, taking that knowledge about cannabis in those countries and bringing it to the federal government of that government, or bringing that experience to Vienna, that helps move the process along. There's countries that may actually vote no on these recommendations, even though they have this history of cannabis as a medicine and traditional medicine, and need desperately more options for their doctors to work with. It's really something that there's so many things you can do, but it is going to take some imagination and following along. Matt, you want to give your websites? Maybe people can find the information, and Nick as well.
Sure. Well, as far as where you can contact me, I work at Yetter Coleman. My email is mzo@yettercoleman.com. As far as the brief is concerned, I imagine it's going to be posted on Marijuana Moment fairly soon. We did an interview there today, and I think they're writing a story. So maybe in the next day or two, I think that might be the easiest way to get it. And as far as what people can do, make this an issue you care about. I mean, I assume by being on this webcast, you already do care about, but, you know, I maybe talk to other people. I feel like, you know, a lot of people are relying on medical marijuana for a variety of conditions and whatnot, but it doesn't seem to me to be an election type issue. And I think it really should be. Where you stand on something like this shows whether or not you care about sick people getting their medicine, and frankly, just even about researching and finding out the truth. I mean, this is just you know, for my client, she just wants to do clinical studies with the marijuana people, you know, or cannabis that people are using. And we just want to find out the truth, and we're not able to do that. So this is an issue that I think matters. And when I talk to people, I try to explain to them why it matters. I try to explain to them, especially the veteran community. And I think that's, you know, it's about educating people. And, you know, if your local representative is not in favor of it, figure out why. I don't understand why anyone would be opposed to research. I don't know why anyone would be opposed. I mean, I do know why, but, you know, no good reason why. So that's what I would say is as far as a call to action.
Does anyone think that the pandemic will make a difference?
The pandemic hasn't altered the flow of these meetings. I want to point out how unprecedented this is. The World Health Organization does this kind of review process for all these different drugs, most of them really horribly dangerous, like carfentanil or something. And they just passed that right into law at the commission with just a single vote and almost no, you know, a little tiny bit of discussion. And this has been like 6 different whole day sessions on cannabis where the World Health Organization has come to the UN and answered question after question endlessly. Thank God they're so patient and they're so, you know, able to consume all this. I want to really pat the World Health Organization expert committee on drug dependence. That's who carries the ball on this. It's under the Essential Medicines Department of the WHO. And they've done a really good amount of work, like I said before, but they've learned everything that we've learned, and they're out there explaining it. And it's so much better to have the World Health Organization explain it to the UN than us, the cannabis movement. I'm sure you would agree. And they've done a good job. So they have, you know, I think 2 more unprecedented meetings to discuss these World Health Organization recommendations and ask questions and give input before they finally vote. And each and every one of these sessions is just another amazing thing that's never happened before.
Thank you so much. really great stuff. Looking forward to the article in Marijuana Moment and, you know, getting an update. So thank you everyone on this panel for